Recently, I've been doing a tremendous amount of repetition throwing, be it mugs, espresso cups, or these miniature angular vases, for which, to get their shapes right, I've been using both pointers on my throwing gauge, which isn't something I actually do all too often. But after throwing about a dozen of these initially, with only the top pointer, I very quickly realised I'd need something to measure the angle around the waist, as they weren't quite as identical as I'd like. These vases will be available as a very limited edition run later this year at YSP, the Yorkshire Sculpture Park. This is an exhibition that will coincide with the launch of my book, By My Hands, A Potter's Apprenticeship, which is available to pre-order now and will be published on the 14th of September, and I'll leave links to both the exhibition and the book down in the description below. I threw each of these vases from 190 grams, which is about 6.7 ounces. The shapes themselves are relatively simple, yet it was making sure that each one was more or less identical that was the real challenge. Simple cylinders, like the espresso cups I made recently, are one thing, but pieces like this with very distinct, sharp angles is another challenge altogether, and one where a second arm on my throwing gauge becomes exceedingly useful. The arms of the throwing gauge have a soft, rubber pointer which can be set and fastened in certain positions to measure both the height and the diameter of the pot you're making. Normally, I only use the top pointer, but this is an instance where the second one is utterly invaluable. I begin by pulling up a cylinder which meets the top pointer. Then, with consecutive pulls, I gradually ease the waist out, bellying out the form until it almost hits the gauge below. As I'm throwing, I often check whether the throwing gauge's pointer is resting in the correct position, as sometimes bits of clay get stuck further down the pointer and prevent it from falling down to the right position. So by lifting it up and down a number of times and seeing it fall back down into exactly the right place gives me all the reassurance I need. And with those 2 points roughly set, I begin defining the angular section between them, which is really just a bit of fingertip throwing. With the basic shape there, I can begin running through the finishing procedures. This starts by sponging out all the excess water and slip from inside the vessel. I then scrape away some of the excess from around the base, and then with a sharp metal kidney, I begin to properly define the shape. I'm pushing the clay out against the metal edge, rather than forcing the metal into it, and I want to make sure that this sharp angular change around the waist lines up perfectly with the throwing gauge next to it. And then I continue to do the exact same thing to the 2 sections above. I then use a soaked chamois leather just to soften the rim, and then to get this thing off the wheel without it colliding into one of these pointers, I flick up the top gauge only and then glide a twisted wire underneath which just ever so slightly pulls the pot away from the pointer. Then, in order to lift the pot neatly away from the wheel, I use the sharp edge of a plastic bucket to scrape all the slip off my hands. I then clasp them around the base and carefully lift the pot away. When throwing this many pieces, there's 100 in this batch, there's always a few which don't go well, be it a strange air pocket like this one had, which caused it to tear around the base and almost rip off the wheel as I pulled the clay up. In cases like this, there's no point trying to salvage this piece, rather it's simply quicker and easier to remove this piece of clay and begin throwing the next, and then simply weigh and wedge up some more clay to make a replacement with.
Yes, sir? Good boy.
The more I made of these, the faster I got, and the entire process to make 100 of these took the better part of a day. It is repetitive, but a good audiobook really does speed things up. And one last thing to mention for the throwing of these is the mirror I have in front of me. It's into this I'm looking for much of the throwing process, to see if the clay is hitting the pointers in the right place. As from my view above, it's more difficult to see the actual shape of the pot and where both pointers actually are, and so a mirror like this really helps. As soon as the rims of these are firm enough, I'll flip them over so their undersides are pointing up and can dry out more easily. In this case, those already flipped are the ones I made in the morning, and the fully stacked board thrown in the afternoon. And as these pots are relatively thin on the rim, I'll cover them quite well with plastic overnight, as I certainly don't want them to dry out too much, as if you do accidentally let the clay get too dry, it can be practically impossible to trim them properly. And I'd rather let them dry during the day when I'm in the studio and I have control over the whole situation. And I quickly sort through them, choosing which will be trimmed first, and letting those that are still softer sit out longer. And this process of monitoring the clay's condition is something I'll keep doing throughout the entire day, so that the stoneware is always in the optimal condition to be trimmed. As if the clay is allowed to get too firm, you'll end up using an excessive amount of pressure when using the trimming tools, and you can potentially injure yourself by straining your wrist. And if the clay is too soft, the pot will be deformed as you press the tools into it. You won't be able to easily attach it to the wheel, and you certainly won't be able to trim it as thin as you might like, as the clay simply won't be able to support itself. Alongside my normal maker's mark, I'll also be using one of these YSP stamps I made, carved from porcelain and reduction fired, and I'll include a link in the top right corner now, and in the description below, that demonstrates exactly how I make these porcelain stamps. Each one of these probably takes as long to trim as it does to throw, and I trim practically every surface, from the outside walls and the base, to the lip, and even the top interior portion of the wall, and each ends up being very light. To firmly stick the pot onto the wheel, I brush some slip onto the base, and tap center the vase so it spins in the middle of the wheel. Beyond the form of the pot, the most important part to get right on every single piece if you want them to look identical is the lip. If you throw 100 pots and the rims of all of them are slightly different, then from above the pots won't look identical, as thick rims will make some pots appear heavy, some rims might slope out and others might angle inward, making the pot's form feel enclosed. So as I was trimming this batch of work, I tried my best to make the rim of every single pot to be as similar as possible. And with the lip and the inner wall done, I can begin trimming the outside angles of the pot, removing a bit of excess weight from the shape and really define those sharp angles that make up this pot. There isn't a huge amount to trim away from each of these, but the process still takes time, and I find whenever I'm trimming I'm hyper vigilant, with my left hand gripping the pot ready to catch it at any moment. The thumbs of both my hands connect to add stability to my movements, and I grip the bladed tungsten carbide trimmer right by the end, which gives me a lot of control. Once I've finished using the sharp tungsten, I use these slightly blunt steel trimmers as they leave the surface burnished and smooth. And I use a plastic kidney to more or less do the same thing to the inside walls of the pot. It can then be sliced off the wheel head, and before I flip the pot onto its rim, I first scrape clean the wheel head, so no specks of clay stick themselves onto the delicate rim. Once again the pot is lightly tap-centered into the middle, and then the pot is secured in place with 3 lumps of soft clay, which are not pushed directly into the pot. Rather, I press them down and let the clay that squashes out be the material that holds the pot in place. As if I were to directly push these lumps of clay firmly into the pot itself, they could deform the delicate rim or push the pot off-centre. I could still remove a bit more clay from the base of this pot, so whilst pushing down very firmly with my left hand, I just skimmed over the surface to remove a few more millimetres of clay, before scraping over the lot with a long flat metal edge to make sure this portion of the pot is nice and straight, as opposed to bowing out slightly with a subtle curve. The bottom edge is then beveled, and work on the base can begin, which mainly consists of burnishing it to a lovely smooth finish, which I do by firmly pressing a smooth surface against the clay to compress it. Sometimes, if this doesn't leave quite the quality I'm after, I'll dab some water onto the base and then do it again, and that's normally enough to give it a nice, glassy finish. And then at last I stamp the pot with my own maker's mark, which is a simple small F, and then beneath that I press in the YSP mark, rocking it from corner to corner so it leaves a clear, legible impression. Although I prefer the trimming process to throwing, it certainly feels far more monotonous, and I almost feel like a machine after a day spent trimming. And not in a good way. My back will ache a little bit, and my hand and wrist will too, from gripping the turning tool for 8 hours straight. But it's such a gratifying experience to see them all lined up like this, their angular shapes repeating, and all the bases pointing up. Although I'm still never quite sure whether it's best to dry pots on their base, or on the rim, in terms of which keeps the rim more circular and which is more likely to cause the vessel to deform. So if you do have any experience with this, I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts. And now I'll let all of these turn bone dry before bisque firing them, glazing them, and then reduction firing them. But I'll have to save that for a future video, as I've only just finished glazing all of these and haven't fired a single one yet, other than a simple prototype. Anyway, thank you, as always, for watching, and a tremendous thank you to anybody who's ordered my book. There's less than 100 days to go now until its release, and I can't tell you how excited I am for you all to read it. But until then, I'll see you next week.